Dr. Robert de Ropp, The Master Game was probably the most important book written in 1968, at least from my point of view. And I find it to be a blueprint for what is known as consciousness growth or consciousness change. Yet reviews of it were scant at the time it was published. They seemed to either, the ones that were written seemed to either not understand it at all or to treat it flippantly as, well, now we've got another game, the master game, isn't that cute kind of comment of the reviews I could find. I'd like to look at the book, what you're saying in it. What are the games man is playing, and what is the master game?
Well, you can divide the games people play pretty much into low games and high games. And generally speaking, the most popular of the low games is what I call hog in the trough in the master game, which is simply a mania for accumulating possessions and accumulating money. The second of the low games, of course, is the fame game, which is also extremely popular, which consists in assuring that a lot of people know what your name is and what you look like and more or less what you do. These are, to some extent, well, entirely ego games. They are entirely designed to inflate the ego. Then we come to the high games, which consist in the scientific game, the art game, the religion game. And finally, above them all, is the master game. The high games should, if they're played purely, not be ego games. The artist should not really be concerned with bolstering his ego, but with expression of certain inner feelings of his through the medium of art. The scientist should not be concerned with bolstering his ego. He's concerned with finding out the truth about phenomena. And of course, the religious devotee should certainly not be concerned with bolstering his ego. Unfortunately, the ego intrudes into all these games and intrudes very, very strongly. In fact, artists very often play the art game purely from ego point of view. Their only thought is, will this art of mine, so-called, impress the public? So they're prepared to do practically anything to impress the public, whether it's art or not. And the scientists, of course, have fallen for this trap. Very often they are much more concerned with whether they're going to get the Nobel Award than whether they've actually discovered something which might be significant. And of course, all the religions trip up over the ego thing. My religion is better than your religion. Wars have been fought over this, and heaven knows what disasters have resulted from this ego attitude towards religion. The master game is above all these, and you really cannot play the master game as an ego game. If you do, then you're absolutely certain to go wrong in the game and fail.
You mentioned 5 states of consciousness that are intrinsic to this entering the stream of the master game. You mentioned dreamless sleep and sleep with dreams, and then waking sleep. I think the concept of waking sleep is probably where we should begin, that your understanding of the state of consciousness we are in, most people are in, let's say.
This is a very difficult concept. It's difficult because if you say to somebody, you're asleep, that person will say, no, I'm not, I'm awake. And nature plays a very peculiar trick at that point, because when that person says, I'm awake, he or she wakes up for a moment. They become objectively aware of their existence, which is what we call the beginning of the awakened state. and then they immediately go to sleep again. Now, the state of waking sleep is the state in which man ordinarily spends that part of his life which he doesn't spend sleeping in bed. It has two very important characteristics. The first characteristic is the state of daydreams. A person in this state of waking sleep dreams all the time, or most of the time, let us say. These daydreams go through the head, dealing with either events which have happened in the past or events which this person thinks might happen in the future. In other words, this person in the state of waking sleep is not present in the now, but is lost in a dream. The second characteristic of the state is identification. Identification is a very difficult term to describe. It means that you do not have any existence separate from what you're thinking, feeling, experiencing at that moment. Identification can be deeper or shallower. If you want to see people in a state of really deep identification, you go to something like a baseball game. People are so identified that they don't exist at all. They're totally immersed in what's happening out there. Or a thrilling performance in the theater or the movies. They don't have any existence at all. Totally identified. Now, these two conditions keep man in sleep, so that if he wishes to awaken, he must first of all recognize that this state of dreams, daydreams, and this state of identification is not necessary, not pleasant, not desirable, and can be struggled with. And this is where the master game actually begins, with a struggle against these states.
You call the approach creative psychology, and you call it a higher synthesis, a new level of order in the psyche. Can you tell us a bit about what creative psychology encompasses?
Yes, in this system of teaching, we believe that man is a being who fails to develop to the fullest extent. If you compare man, say, to an insect like a butterfly doesn't emerge from the egg like a little teensy butterfly. It emerges as a worm-like creature, a caterpillar, which eats and eats and grows and grows. And then it changes into a chrysalis, and from the chrysalis it emerges as a butterfly, the fully developed form. Now, we regard man as being something like a butterfly which failed to get past the chrysalis stage. Nature takes man up to a certain point. She ensures that he develops to the point where he becomes sexually mature and can reproduce his kind. But nature does not guarantee that he develops any further. Indeed, it seems as if nature has placed certain specific obstacles in his way, so that he doesn't even know that he has these possibilities. Now, creative psychology is the psychology of man's development beyond, let us say, the chrysalis stage. The realization of certain powers which exist in man, but which he doesn't ordinarily use.
Dr. Ropp, let me pose a hypothesis for you. Many of the spiritual teachings of the world talk about transcending the ego. And, for instance, in Zen, they talk about a state of emptiness, or the Tao. In your state of sleep that you describe, of identification of, say, perhaps at the opera or at a sports event where people move out of their identification and become identified with the event, what would you say would be the relationship between that state of literally moving beyond the ego and the state of awake or awareness that you're talking about?
Well, in the case of identification, the individual has really no existence at all. He is really like a puppet on the end of a string being pulled around by what's happening out there. And if his side is winning, he'll shout blah, 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 good, 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 and if it's losing, he'll say, oh, no, and so on. And he's just exactly like a puppet. He's pulled this way, pulled that way by events happening outside. And in the case of the individual who's transcended the ego and is absolutely going with the flow, there isn't any question of being pulled about. That person knows where his body is and what's going on around him and is fully conscious of his inner world and his outer world and doesn't separate the two. The inner and the outer world harmonize together. Now, this is what is meant really by transcending the ego in these teachings you're talking about. It's an entirely different thing. It tastes entirely different. You can only go by taste in this area.
In your lifetime, Dr. de Ropp, have you met anyone who has transcended the ego?
Well, that's very hard to say, because how can you tell? I may have.
Is there anyone of particular significance that perhaps sticks in your mind as someone that had an effect on you?
Well, it's probable that the people whom I studied with, namely chiefly Uspensky and Gurdjieff, had both transcended the ego to some extent, but they fluctuated like all of us do. There were times when they were down and there were times when they were up. I can't think offhand of anybody I could say who was permanently up. We all fluctuate. Even evidence from the Gospels indicate even that as high a being as Jesus fluctuated. After all, he did irrational things like cursing a fig tree. And
I'm wondering, there's some people that say Gurdjieff was a man of massive ego, and yet you're suggesting that perhaps he transcended the ego as well. I'm wondering if you might comment on that.
I think it's perfectly possible to be both. I think in certain moods, Gurdjieff was a man of massive ego. And in other moods, he was way above the ordinary level. He was a man of enormous power. Perhaps he got stuck on a power trip. It's difficult to tell. Unless you actually knew Gurdjieff, you can't imagine how different he was from most people.
Could you help us know him a bit, your experiences with him? What was he like for you? Maybe some anecdotes or visions, stories?
Oh, he was him. I can't describe him. He was quite unlike a man from Mars, if you like. He came from a different planet. I mean, he could sit there squeezing on his little accordion thing, which he played, play this strange music, and look at you in a certain way, and you had this feeling that this man has been around for a fantastic time. Maybe he saw the pyramids being put up. Not in that body, of course. It was just that feeling of a man who saw over enormous perspectives. He didn't see you like ordinary people did. He didn't look at you like ordinary people did. He saw right through you. And this could be rather disturbing.
Any particular instances in which you experienced him with other people, or doing this with you, for example?
Oh, I could cite various instances, but Gurdjieff is dead, and the real essence of our problem right now is to disentangle ourselves from Gurdjieff and Uspensky and other gurus, and this whole tendency to develop a personality cult, and come back to the question of what really are the basic teachings. I didn't know Gurdjieff at all well. I met him in New York, and I was with him for quite a short while, but I knew Uspensky very well. And Uspensky always said, this teaching is a bunch of fragments, and we have to try and bring all the fragments together. A lot of it is missing. And I have the impression now that the bringing of the fragments together is impossible for the ordinary mind. In other words, you have to tap a certain higher mind in order to integrate the whole thing so that the entire system of teaching becomes integrated. The ordinary mind is not capable of handling it. So we have to learn how to awaken higher mind. And higher mind exists in us. But it's like a machine which we can't hook up to. Our level of consciousness is simply not sufficiently high for us to hook up to this very, very powerful machine. Now, you can hook up to this machine sometimes accidentally and sometimes through the use of drugs, LSD especially. But the evidence suggests that when you hook up in this way, you can't bring anything back. In other words, you get so much information poured into your consciousness, such as it is, that it simply overloads your machinery, and you blow a fuse at that point, and you simply pass out. You become unconscious. It often happens that people who've had some powerful LSD experience say after it, if only I could remember. But they can't remember. So much material came to them during that period that they simply can't possibly hold on to any of it. It's all gone. It's lost.
You've mentioned that there seems to have been some kind of an error in human evolution that prevents us from getting into the fourth or fifth state of consciousness. What do you know about that error?
The error is in the formation of the brain and in the relationships between the three brains of man. It's been described at great length by Arthur Koestler in his book, The Ghost in the Machine. The three brains can be represented more or less as the brain of an alligator, the brain of a horse, and the brain of a man. The alligator brain is instinctive, and it takes care of instinctive functions. The horse brain is predominantly emotional. The man brain is a tremendously complex machine, which we don't know how to use. Between the mismanaged man brain and the highly emotional, highly undisciplined horse brain, there is a fundamental disharmony. And the man brain picks up certain information and passes it on to the horse brain. And the horse brain gets all worked up and starts to shy and rear and rush around and create all sorts of fantasies, which it feeds back to the man brain, which adds more fantasies to it. So we get these disastrous attacks of generalized psychosis, really. I mean, I was recently rereading a history of World War I, and thinking now that whole thing was a result of disharmony between those two brains. The whole thing was simply a paranoid delusion. Millions of people killed for what? For nothing. So the fundamental error is there, the disharmony between those two brains.
Is it that man's role, the current stage in evolution, is simply that man getting in charge of his own mind and that part of his physiology, that part of the brain that's out of order? Or could that in fact be exactly what evolution is about at this point? How did this thing crop up to begin with, that it cropped up wrong?
Well, man is a very strange being, you know. He's a carnivore without the carnivore's excuse. He's gone a way entirely different from the other primates. He spent thousands and thousands of years simply fighting for his sheer existence. And this developed in him a tendency to behave in a rather savage way. He's a very savage animal. He's the killer of killers. You know. And this red savage still lurks down there in the old part of the brain, embedded there by centuries and centuries of bashing about, killing prey, killing his fellow men. And now he's reached a stage of his development where he simply cannot afford to do this anymore. With A-bombs, H-bombs, etc., he cannot afford to do this anymore. He's faced with this difficult choice. He must either learn to behave differently, or he's going to wipe himself off the face of the earth and most of the biosphere with him. So he's got to evolve fast.
Your mention of the personality cults that say have built up around someone like Gurdjieff, and certainly we're experiencing a great deal of that in this time with many of gurus that have come from the East, gurus that are appearing in our midst. I'm wondering how you see that, and how you see that in relationship to the search for the inner guru, which your comments are implying.
Well, it's generally true that people would do almost anything rather than think for themselves. They want it dished out. This is the truth. Why is it the truth? Because I tell you it's the truth. So they like authority. They like to be told what is the truth. They want to believe. And it's obvious that gurus can take advantage of this longing to believe, and that they do. They simply say, now believe me, this is so. This is the way to do it. All right, so the followers tag along, and they just love it. Gurdjieff used to say that these two qualities of the human psyche, credulity and suggestibility, are the primal curse, so to speak. Man will swallow any old tale, or as he used to put it, cream from the navel of the estimable Scheherazade.
How does one know that he knows, then, that he is, his insight, his inner voice, as Michael puts it, is correct, when there are others who say that they know, and yet it's different than what one feels he knows? This whole metaphysical problem of knowing that you know, and others say they know, and it's different.
Oh, you could tell you have certain definite reactions, like the taste of salt, for instance. You know what salt tastes like. I could talk for a year, and I couldn't describe to you how salt tastes. But if you tasted salt, you know. Okay. There is a function in the human psyche which we call objective conscience, which will tell you the difference between the truth and the lies. If objective conscience is functioning in you, or if you can bring it to the point where it does function, you will know. This is the Holy Spirit of the Christian Gospels, the Spirit of truth. And when it works in somebody, that somebody doesn't have to go off to some guru and say, is this true or isn't it? That person knows.
How does one activate this objective conscience?
Well, in the beginning, we have to determine who is talking in us. We have various characters who take over the stage, and they play their roles. And they are all characterized by certain archetypes in the tarot cards. For instance, there's the fool and there's the devil. Now, these are two archetypes which characterize man in deep sleep. The fool is always lost in dreams. He wanders along with a sack on his back which contains all the sacred symbols, but he doesn't know what they mean. He doesn't even know what's in the sack. He's dreaming. He doesn't even know his pants are falling down. This is the fool. The devil is the liar in man, the father of lies. He always lies. Now, as long as you are dominated by the fool and devil, you cannot possibly have objective conscience. In order to have objective conscience, you have to begin to come under the sign of the hanged man. The hanged man has sacrificed his personal ego and particularly his habit of lying. He's been literally turned upside down. This is a symbol of truth. The juggler is also a symbol of truth, of a different kind. The juggler uses skillful means. And the Hierophant and the High Priestess are also symbols of truth, symbols of objective knowledge. And if you come under these symbols, or if you can bring out these archetypes in yourself and develop them as opposed to the others, then you'll develop objective conscience.
And will that always correspond to what someone else is doing in the same mode? Will there ever be contradictions or differences?
Well, it's said that the human population can be divided up into a great big mass of people who are on the outside, the exoteric group, a group of people who are trying to get to the inner circle, the mesoteric group, and a group that are in the inner circle, the esoteric group. Now, the inner circle of humanity, by definition, operates through objective conscience. In other words, they have the capacity to know objectively. They don't deceive themselves and they don't deceive one another, and they can communicate. This is the basis of the idea of the communion of saints in the Christian teaching. They understand each other and they won't argue. So if an argument develops, you can be quite sure that those particular gurus are not really in the inner circle.
So how do you account for the differences between these teachers which seem to be telling the truth? You would have to say that each of them somehow is lost in his ego in some degree?
Oh, some of them are lost in their egos, and some of them present the truth from different angles, from different points of view. But if they really are objective men or women, they will not have any arguments. They say, yes, well, I see it from this angle and you see it from that angle, but it doesn't make any difference.
How about a man like J. Krishnamurti? Are you familiar with his work? Have you met him?
Yes, he's one of the very few individuals who always strikes the clear note. I've never known Krishnamurti talk nonsense. That's saying a lot.
So, have you ever known Gurdjieff to talk nonsense?
Well, yes, because Gurdjieff could talk in all sorts of different ways and sometimes talk absolute nonsense, but this was not necessarily because he didn't know it was nonsense. He could play all kinds of roles.
That the roles and the personas goes back to the particular core of getting into the fourth room, the fourth state of consciousness, as I experience it. Maybe we could talk about how you go about getting into that fourth room, what approaches you use or methods.
Perhaps you could talk about the previous three, too, and what were the fourth and fifth states of consciousness.
Well, we did that, the sleeping, then dream sleep, and then waking sleep, which is what most people are in now. The fourth state is the self-remembering or transcending, and how to get into that state. I'm thinking of the awareness or the attention as one thing you've outlined. And
Curious thing about the fourth state is that the methods to be used to get into that state are really not very not complicated at all. There are 4 principles of work on being which will enable you to get into the fourth room, and they can be expressed quite simply. The first principle is stop thoughts, be here now. The second principle, learn to convert your poisons into honey. This has to do with the transmutation of negative emotions. The third principle, substitute intentional doing for accidental happening. And the fourth principle, do nothing unnecessary or avoid unnecessary karma. Now, anybody who can apply those principles really consistently will sooner or later enter the fourth room.
How is that distinguished from the fifth and last room then? The experience
They aren't
there?
very clearly distinguished. They really blend into each other. As you expand your consciousness, you become more and more aware of your unity with the totality. You become aware of the cosmic whole, if you like, the total cosmic drama. We are integrally part of the cosmic drama. We cannot separate ourselves from it. Insofar as we separate ourselves from it, we are asleep. If we awaken, then we become aware of the totality. So really the fourth room simply expands into the fifth room.
I'd like to ask you, Dr. Ropp, about that third step you mentioned, substituting intentional doing for accidental happenings. Could you further explain that a little more?
Yes, the principle is simply this, that in the state of sleep, we do not do, we cannot do, it does us. We react mechanically to stimulus. We don't move intentionally. Intentional activity is very beautiful activity. For instance, if you watch a really good master of the Japanese tea ceremony, every movement is intentional. And this intentionality will produce a definite inner awareness. For instance, I can put out my arm and know that I'm doing so. Or it can put out the arm. That is to say, it acts just like a puppet pulled out by a string. An important part of the Gurdjieffian teaching deals with intentional movement. In fact, there is a long series of exercises developed by Gurdjieff and Madame de Salzmann, which are entirely involve intentional movement. Through intentional movement, you can actually get the sensation of self-remembering.
Intrinsic to the question of who man is beyond his games, you point out the essence, the persona, and the ego. Could you elaborate on what the essence is and the other two aspects as the human condition presents itself to you at this point?
Yes, you can use this word essence as being more or less that which man is born with. Essence determines type. Type determines fate. People's essence is always very closely related to their physical type. And the three main physical types, or the three parameters of physical type, which Sheldon has specified, endomorphy, mesomorphy, and ectomorphy, can give to some extent a clue to the essence.
Can you maybe illustrate with what your essence is, or what your combination is on that scale of 1 to 7 that you point out in the book?
Well, you've got to understand that the body type or somatotype is one thing, and the temperament type is another thing. Sheldon wrote 2 books, one of which dealt with varieties of temperament and one dealt with varieties of physique. There is a correlation, but it isn't always very close. For instance, if you take a person who is high in ectomorphy, which I happen to be, he is also likely to be high in cerebrotonia, predominantly cerebral, lives in his nervous system, thinks. A thinker rather than one who acts. Now, different people have different predominant centers. You can say that there are people who live mainly through their moving center. They are people who love physical activity. They can be very good athletes, adventurers, explorers. They are nearly always high mesomorphs. They look something like professional footballers. And you can say there are people who live almost predominantly in their emotional centers. They may have a lot of endomorphy. These emotional people are very often rather oval in outline. Then there are people who live predominantly in their intellectual centers. The correlation between the physical type and the center which predominates, however, is not by any means 100%. And because of this lack of correlation, Sheldon's principles of typing people have been criticized pretty severely by a lot of psychologists.
To the extent it is so, how does it relate to one's essence, and exactly what is that essence again in relationship to that?
Essence is what you're born with. Essence is your inborn characteristics. You can have all sorts of qualities in essence, such as, for instance, you can have a good ear for music. You can have a natural talent for drawing. What we call talent is an essence quality. You don't develop talents, you're born with talent.
How does that distinguish between what has been known as the spirit or the soul, then?
There's a relationship of essence and God, for an example.
Well, actually, the soul is an entirely different idea. The soul is thought of in this system of teaching as a higher being body which is developed through certain kinds of intentional effort. The soul cannot be developed unless the essence is sound. There is possibility of the growth of essence. That is to say, essence is not absolutely fixed. There can be growth in essence. Now you have to understand that the essence and the personality are different in this way, that essence is what you're born with, but personality is what you acquire through contact with the culture in which you're born. So the kind of personalities which we see around now in modern America are different from the kind of personalities you'd be likely to encounter in ancient Rome, for instance. So personality reflects the culture in which you're born, but essence is something intrinsic. Now, personality tends to develop what you might call malignant growth, which we call the false ego. The false ego is not necessary. The false ego generally centers around some kind of negative emotion, or what we call negative emotion, pride, envy, and so forth. It very often happens, especially in city people, that the false ego takes over everything. They become actually nothing but false ego. And if you've been trained in the right way, you can detect this. The falseness is so obvious that it jars on you like a bad note in music. One of the most difficult tasks for people who are in this position is to try to get away from this false ego. Try to weaken it. Try not to live in it all the time. Because if you live in the false ego, you are virtually dead. You're a walking corpse, a zombie.
Well, when one is in the fourth state, or the transcendent self-remembering state of consciousness, he would be dealing directly from his essence, I take it.
Yes, in the fourth state, essence is certainly predominant, but because people have to deal with their fellow men, they need persona. Persona is a mask, and it is necessary. You can't always be showing everything. For instance, if you want an example, you can say that very often among simple peasant people, they are very simple. They are almost entirely essence. They have practically no persona at all. If you introduce them into a big city, for instance, where persona is dominant, they'll feel absolutely lost. They can't cope. They don't have any persona to speak of. See? The rural atmosphere, the country life, tends to cause essence to dominate over persona. The city life tends to cause persona to dominate over essence and false ego to dominate persona. Hence the need to avoid city life.
I'm wondering, you mentioned again the negative emotions and their effect on the ego. And earlier you had mentioned as one of the things that needs to be done is transmuting these negative emotions into positive forms. I'm wondering if you have any practical suggestions for how to do that.
Certainly. The most common cause of persistence in negative emotions is justification. We justify them. We say, yes, I got angry or I got envious, but I had every good reason to do so. Now, this attitude that negative emotions are justifiable causes them to be perpetuated. If you take the opposite attitude and say, no, they are not justifiable, they are not necessary, they use up energy, and they don't produce any desirable results, then little by little, you can teach your emotional center through your intellectual center. The intellectual center can talk to the emotional center. Say, now listen, you don't have to behave this way. It's not necessary. It's not cool. It's not desirable. And after a time, and it's a very long time, I have to say, the emotional center may actually get the point and stop manifesting in this way. You must realize that it is enormously difficult to retrain the emotional center because we can't talk to it direct. We can't manipulate it directly. We have to get at it indirectly through talking to it through the intellectual center. You have to realize also that in our culture, such a cult of negative emotion exists in the form of all sorts of crime and violence, constantly dished out by the media, that this overcoming of negative manifestations is made very, very difficult. Children from the earliest ages are exposed to all this garbage which pours out, and they get the idea that negative emotions are rather heroic. It's quite the thing to do. And to retrain them later on, it may be very difficult.
Of course, to some extent, to people perhaps living in the ghetto and that kind of thing, it's one of the ways that they identify with getting attention and calling attention to their plight, this kind of thing.
Well, I know they do that, but it doesn't improve things very much. And you can go up blowing up the Bank of America and doing things of that kind, but it's probably not the best way to go about it.
I would think not.
Is the persona then the ego that's talked about in other systems, that identifying with who I think I am?
Yes, the persona is the seat of the ego.
They're the same.
Pretty much.
You mentioned pretty much, you say there's not any, you have no withholds regarding that.
Well, really, persona is based on essence, in the sense that if you lay out a certain foundation to a building, the building will always have to have a certain form, which is determined by the foundation, see? And the persona always has a certain form, which is determined by the essence. And a roly-poly endomorph like Falstaff, for instance, will have one kind of persona, and a skinny ectomorph like Hamlet will have another kind of persona. And Hamlet could no more play a convincing Falstaff than Falstaff could play a convincing Hamlet. So the persona is always sort of based on the essence. Persona doesn't disappear as a person develops, but it's transmuted. It takes second place.
You said in the book that destroying any of the various personas that we have would be a disastrous thing. I've heard that said, perhaps not exactly by you. Is that, why is that? Just getting rid of one of them?
Well, we don't have the power to do it in actual fact. They'll all be there, sitting around. But you change the pecking order, so to speak.
I've heard another man, Dr. Frederick Leboyer, you may be familiar with his work. He's told me that he's seen people who've actually gotten rid of the ego in that sense, and it's been a disastrous thing. Do you have any, what I'm really looking for is errors that can be made in traveling the path, and trying to get rid of the ego. Are you familiar with that, and how is that disastrous?
I've never met anybody who's really gotten rid of the ego. There are certainly all kinds of traps on the path. We can go into that if you want to.
Let's do then.
Before we go into that, before we leave essence and persona, one of the things you mentioned was that essence tends to come to the forefront in a rural society, rural area, and persona is more predominant in city and urban areas. And this would imply essence being the real center of things, that we should close down our cities, that people should move from the cities into country life. And also I want to relate this to the fact that back in the late 60s, there was a dropout factor, that there was a heavy movement to back the land. It's still there, but there's also a movement to dropping back in, that people seem to be coming back from the retreat areas and moving back into life in the world. And I just wanted to have you comment on that with respect to persona and essence.
Well, the balanced man, the balanced person, has to maintain both essence and persona, has to be able to function in both environments, in both the city environment and the rural environment. This is the ideal. If you can only function effectively living in a cave somewhere in the Himalayas, then you're not a balanced individual.
Yet there are certain people who shouldn't deal with other people. You mentioned the problems a cerebrotonic type would have dealing with the strong mesomorph in his approach to life, and cerebrotonic needs to be off by himself more. He's more creative when he's not so involved or surrounded by others.
Yes, in his undeveloped form, he needs a lot of solitude, but he can reach the point of development where he can create that solitude even when he's among a lot of people. A fully developed individual is able to create an inner sanctuary under almost any conditions. There's a Tibetan saying, by skillful means you can be comfortable even in hell.
What have the pitfalls been along the way in your traveling the path of the master game? What ones are you familiar with?
Well, there are several of them, of course. And one of the first is the fact that people who are predominantly in persona think and talk about the inner work instead of doing it. Then they get hooked on the guru. That's another very, very common one. They get stuck on the guru. Whatever the guru says, they'll do. If he tells them to throw themselves over a cliff, they probably do it. They completely lose discrimination. They become totally without inner strength. They just rely on their teacher. Then the teacher himself can fall into the trap of thinking that he's a big shot, and false messiah syndrome. That develops very commonly. And then the most subtle one of them all is the personal salvation syndrome. Now, it's a very peculiar thing that you have to play the master game very lightly. If you get over-identified with the idea of becoming a master, you'll stop at that point. You'll get stuck. You can develop power through playing the master game. You can develop power. And you can get stuck on the mountain of power, because there are two mountains, the mountain of power and the mountain of liberation. And you can get stuck on that mountain of power, so that you're really a very powerful person. And you can influence people, because people in general are so weak. You can influence them, you can draw large numbers of them after you, you can take millions of their precious dollars, and have a thorough big power trip. But you get stuck there.
Well,
Dr. Ropp, you were talking about power trips, and one of the things that certainly is manifested in our society in this time is the power trip with an emphasis on money. And perhaps we can talk about that a little bit, because in Western culture, especially in America, anything new comes along, like the spiritual path and such things as that. Now, money has been tied to that, and so for 2 weekends, we'll give you instant enlightenment. We'll show you the way. How do you see that?
Yes, unfortunately, it's the world's oldest con game. For such and such a sum, we will pilot your soul through the after-death world. We will make sure that you get into heaven. We will make sure that you get higher consciousness. Just a little bit more. We haven't quite made it yet. A few more dollars or whatever. It's the world's oldest con game. And suckers fall for it all the time. And there's an enormous crop of suckers in our present culture. So you can do very nicely out of them. But unfortunately, this has absolutely nothing to do with the master game. Absolutely nothing to do with it. You cannot charge money. If you are in fact a guide on the way, a genuine one, you aren't even interested in whether people have money or not. It's got nothing to do with it. There are very, very few people who can actually tread the path. Most of them will drop out. And the only thing a real master is concerned with is finding those few people. And he may have to work with hundreds or even thousands of people in order to find a little tiny handful who can actually get somewhere. He is not interested in money. For heaven's sakes, he's grown out of that hog in the trough game long ago.
Well, it's been said, and especially with some of these people saying that, because this question comes up quite a bit, why do you charge so much with something that renders value to humanity, so to speak? And the response, the common response, the consensus response, seems to be that because of being raised in this society and the conditioning is such that we have learned to equate money with value. And if it's not, if it doesn't cost money, then we're not going to get anything out of it. And if it's free, then you're not going to do anything with it. Maybe you can comment on that.
Well, you have to admit that there's something in that point of view, yes. Some people do only value the teachings which they've paid for. The question is, what does the teacher do with the money? If he wants it for himself, then he's definitely got stuck on a power trip and is just playing hog in the trough in a rather more advanced style than it's usually played. If he himself is completely indifferent to money, but just realizes that in certain cases these people have got to be made to pay because they worship money and that's all they value, and they won't value the teaching unless they have to pay for it. If he's at that level, that's quite a different game. After all, you remember the classic case of the rich young man who came to Jesus and wanted to follow his way, and Jesus said to him, "Sell all that you have." But he did not say, "Give it to me." He said, "Sell all that you have and give to the poor, and take up your cross and follow me." And he could not do so. And Jesus said, "How hardly shall they that have riches enter into the kingdom? It is easier for a camel to pass through a needle's eye," which is absolutely true.
You're saying that the path is a very narrow one and only a few people really could seriously be on it. Cuts out a whole spectrum of spiritual questing and a whole population in California and elsewhere that's into this. Do you see them as just being part-timers who really won't continue?
Oh, they play a game which is probably based on talking and thinking. The talk-think syndrome is one of the biggest traps of all. So they get together and they hold seminars and they trot around to lectures and they exchange views and they read a lot of books and
do radio programs.
And So it goes. It's got nothing to do with development.
It would seem that, well, you did say in your book that it's better not to embark upon the game at all than to play it half-heartedly. You run the risk of destroying your potential by embarking half-heartedly.
That is true. It is possible for a person to begin to play the game and partially awaken, and then stop playing the game and go to sleep again. And this state is called second sleep. And it's recognized that second sleep is much worse than first sleep. It's much more difficult to wake up from second sleep than from first sleep. In fact, Uspensky used to say that in the Lord's Prayer, where it says, "Deliver us from evil," it should be translated as "Deliver us from the evil," and that the evil actually is second sleep.
This second sleep would equate with someone being turned on, getting into one's essence and experiencing something beyond what someone has experienced before, and then falling back into the persona.
They lose their way for one reason or another. They lose their aim. They no longer remember what they were looking for. I've seen it happen again and again. A person begins. Now, the beginning is always accompanied by an upsurge of energy, a force. We call it the first note of the octave of development, which is very powerful. And this carries them forward until they encounter the first, what we call, interval. The first interval is the point where they run out of that initial energy. And then they lose that initial force. In the religious language, this is called a period of dryness. They no longer have it. This invariably happens. You cannot avoid it. It doesn't mean they go to sleep again. They just don't have that initial force. Then by some means or other, probably being helped by the teacher or being helped by the other students in the group, they get over that, and then they go on. But in some cases, they fall out. They lose their way. Hesse described this very, very clearly in The Journey to the East, a man who lost his way. He lost contact with the League. He, by great difficulty, managed to find it again. It is possible to find it again, certainly, but it is very much more difficult. So it is always said, it's better not to start at all than to start and then drop out.
They say they've also said that once you have experienced this kind of thing, there's no way that you can get away from it. There's no way.
Well, what I'm telling you about only applies to people who've gone a certain distance. I mean, really gone a certain distance, not just talked and thought about the work, but actually begun to change. You have to realize that this teaching is based on alchemy. Alchemy teaches that man can transform certain chemical substances in himself. And by those transformations, he can begin to, so to speak, fuel the higher machines which are present in his totality. They call for this special fuel. He actually changes chemically, or alchemically, if you like. Now, once that change has begun, then it is necessary to go on. If it hasn't begun, it doesn't make any difference, you see. The person is just a mixture. Gurdjieff used a very interesting analogy to describe this. He said that if you mix certain powders, like, for instance, iron filings and sulfur in chemistry, you can mix them together as long as you like, and you can still separate them by mechanical means. But if you heat those two together, at a certain point they will fuse and form something totally different. And that cannot be separated any longer. It's totally different. It's changed. And so with man, at a certain point, through inner work, he changes chemically. And if such a person then abandons the work, then he is truly in a very bad position.
Dr. Ropp, this is a very critical viewpoint for so many people who are getting into these paths with the expectation of changing their, if nothing else, the traumas that they brought from childhood as a initiation, as a reason for getting into the path. Certainly that causes some of this chemical change you're talking about. Then at that point the person is indeed on the path, and your prospectus is that most of them are in for worse than they had before they began, because they're going to fail. They're not going to continue.
Well, you definitely take a risk, but the chemical setup of man is such that he is pretty well protected. Ordinarily, the amount of effort involved in this work simply is not forthcoming. The amount of effort is very great. I'd like to give an example which Gurdjieff was rather fond of. He defined 4 ways, you know: the way of the fakir, the way of the monk, and the way of the yogi, and the 4th way. Now he would describe the way of fakir, which of course is a very elementary way, but it's a fact that there are fakirs in India, and they still exist, who undergo this discipline of holding their arms up above their heads. You can say they're complete lunatics if you like, but just try doing it. Try holding your arms up above your heads, not as they do until they wither at the roots and cannot any longer be lowered, but just for 15 minutes, and see what a struggle is involved. Now, the actual change of the chemistry of the human organism involves a struggle of that order, though not of that order of stupidity. The fakir is a very stupid individual. But he develops physical will in this way. He develops a will which nothing can break. He is an incredibly tough person. And it sometimes happens that yogis get a hold of fakirs and cure their physical defects which they've inflicted upon themselves, and teach them to use that tremendous will that they've developed. Because, of course, the trouble with the fakir is he doesn't know how to use the will he's developed. But you can see from this example the sort of effort we're talking about.
We have fakirs in America too. They're known as fakers.
No, that's a misuse of the word fakir. A fakir is really a devotee who is using or misusing, if you like, the physical body, or using pain, physical pain, and the struggle with physical pain to develop will. He doesn't know why he's doing it, but he does it because he thinks it's pleasing to some god or other, or because his teacher has been doing it. For instance, I read a book which was a description of travels in India by a very intelligent woman, quite a recent book. And she said that in Rishikesh, I think, she met a teacher who had never sat down for 20 years and never slept. And he had a disciple who said, yes, I'm going to be up to the level of the master, I hope, in time. I do sit down occasionally and I sleep for an hour or so every 24 hours, but I expect to be able to follow in the steps of the master. Well, she asked him why. Of course, he didn't know. He couldn't explain. It's because the master does it. He has to do it. See, this is how fakirs operate. They're not very bright, but they have tremendous strength of will.
This brings up the role of suffering in the spiritual quest. And I'm wondering how you see that. Earlier when we were talking about drugs in the mind, you had mentioned that most people don't want to endure discomfort, so they take a pill, so they won't have to. But, like, for instance, in Christianity, there's been a big emphasis on suffering as being a way to the truth. And, of course, the Buddha said that life is suffering. How do you see that?
Well, there's suffering and suffering. On the one hand, it's been said that a person must learn to sacrifice suffering. This is a certain kind of suffering which is inflicted on us by the ego. The ego thinks, oh, people don't treat me right, oh, people don't appreciate me, oh, this, oh, that, and the other thing. Now, that's a totally different kind of suffering from the kind of intentional suffering, which is mentioned also as being necessary for following the way. Intentional suffering means struggling with certain inner habits, certain inner tendencies, and above all, struggling with the desire for comfort. We always want to be too comfortable. And in our civilization, we are made so comfortable that we almost literally turn into cabbages. The least little bit of discomfort is strenuously avoided. But actually, through the struggle with discomfort, we develop strength. Now, the fakir, of course, takes this struggle with discomfort to absurd extremes and damages the body. It's not necessary to damage the body. This is ridiculous. But the right kind of struggle with discomfort strengthens the body and strengthens it enormously. Man is actually a vehicle which is designed to travel very rough roads. If he hadn't been designed very, very tough, he could never have survived. If you compare man, for instance, with his relatives, the apes, man traveled very rough roads, but the apes, one and all, stayed down in the tropics during the ice ages and never traveled very rough roads. The result is that they're on the way to extinction, whereas man is overgrowing the planet like a cancer.
Do you experience there being any higher form in the universe than man?
I don't experience it, but I'm sure there is. I'd hate to think that there wasn't.
How about, you mentioned earlier, Gurdjieff, perhaps not in this life, not in this body, saw the pyramids. That was an allusion to the question of reincarnation. How do you feel about that?
Not necessarily reincarnation. It's possible to pick up information from the past which is not available in the ordinary way. It's possible to know directly the continuity. People who belong to certain archetypes, such as the Magus archetype, they know a great deal, which they could not have learned in this life. For instance, if you read some of the writings of Jung, especially his autobiography, you say, yes, Jung was a Magus. He knew certain things. He knew them even as a child. He didn't learn them. He knew them.
I think of one of the experiences that Stan Grof produced with his experimentation with LSD, of one of the recurring experiences on LSD is that experience of the past and of entire civilizations, in fact. Is this what you're talking about?
Well, something is there in the memory, a sort of collective memory, which we aren't able to tap ordinarily. Perhaps it's the collective unconscious of Jung. We know a great deal about the past, but we don't have access to the knowledge. When Hesse wrote his book, Journey to the East, he made a very big deal about the archives, you remember. Now, the archives contain all this information about past civilizations. And it is possible to make contact with the archives, but only through the higher centers. The ordinary mind cannot get to that material.
What do you feel then does happen as a result of death? What does occur then after that if you're not recognizing actual reincarnation?
You see, death can be a totally different experience for an individual who has developed a soul and an individual who hasn't. If there is no soul, then death is simply the end. The body disintegrates, and with it everything goes. If the soul has been developed, then there is a vehicle which can, to some extent, survive death. It's possible that it can reincarnate. I don't know. This is something we cannot answer definitely. If the individual who dies has become completely liberated, then the soul reblends with the Atman, with the totality. And there is nothing to reincarnate. That person is on the level of Buddha.
In your book, you put down the experiences of people like Annie Besant and C.W. Ledbetter, who said that they experienced beings on other planes. Do you still? That was in 1968 in the Master Game. Do you still hold that that in fact there are no such beings, that it's a delusion of the mind?
Well, Uspensky made a very sound observation about all that theosophical stuff, all those claims about Akashic records and so forth. He said, yes, sure, they can tell you how things were on the lost continent Atlantis, but they can't tell you where you lost a book or something perfectly simple and obvious like that.
So they do exist, and the Katumis and Maitreya's, these beings that come through. You do think this does
It's
happen?
absolutely impossible to generalize. One cannot tell what these people were in contact with. There is a certain area in which, if you experiment in certain ways, Uspensky described this all in his chapter on experimental mysticism, you enter an area in which it appears as if you're receiving communications. Now he, for instance, got this communication when he was in this state that he was thinking about the great temple at Jerusalem, Herod's temple. And this voice said to him there were a lot of flies there. Well, he thought, of course there would be a lot of flies because they had blood sacrifices all the time. The place was probably swarming with flies. It was nothing that he couldn't have thought out for himself. Very often you receive what you think are communications, but in point of fact, they're simply memories. There was a great to-do made over a book called The Search for Bridie Murphy. You may remember about that. It was all just memories, childhood memories. She thought she was picking up a previous incarnation. So you can so easily deceive yourself in this area that really everything in this area has to be treated with the utmost suspicion.
Dr. Ropp, what is your experience? What is it like for you now as far as your consciousness or your experience of who you are or what it is or life's about, like from moment to moment? Could you put it into any description?
Yes, the experience is simply that of the long body of time, the Linga Sharira. This person who's talking now is a cross-section of a process which goes right back to the time of conception and goes right forward to the time of its death. After a certain period in this work, you begin to be aware of the long body, that is to say, of your totality. You are here now. Later on, you'll be further along. Behind you stretches the long body of time. So you no longer sense yourself as being just what you are now, but being all the different people that you were, and also to some extent the people you're going to be.
And you experience this prospect of your being other people after physical death at this time?
It's possible, but I can't tell for sure. I don't know.
In your book, Church of the Earth, you wrote in one of the final chapters about coming into touch with death, that this was important to know death in order to know life. Perhaps you could expand upon that a little bit here.
Definitely, there are certain after-death states which can be experienced before death. The three bardos. For instance, the clear light of the void is something which can definitely be experienced before death. The clear light of the void can be entered into by anybody who knows how. I'll admit that it's not very easy to know how, but it can be experienced. If you have entered into these after-death states before death, you're not in the least bit worried about death. Why should you? A fully developed person can die at will. That's to say, such a person can leave the physical body. Or they can just hold on to it by a very, very slender thread and come back to it. This is well known. It's no big deal.
You had mentioned earlier soul development, and you had talked about people dying that have not developed their souls and then just ceased to be. This implies that some people are walking around without souls. And
Some people, nearly everybody, unfortunately.
Don Juan talked about this as well, that there were people walking the streets that were not alive. Perhaps you could share a little more about that, as to, because there's certainly a large, okay, there may be something different, but there's certainly a large segment of the population who believes everyone has a soul, of course. Everyone has a soul.
Yes, this is a popular myth, and naturally people like to believe this because they want to think that there's something which will go on after death and they'll end up in some sort of heaven or other. But this is simply a popular myth. These people are non-existent. They don't exist in themselves at all. They are puppets pulled about by invisible strings. Sometimes if you're in an altered state of consciousness, you see this. And it's very terrifying. You suddenly see that these people are not alive. It happened to me once on 42nd Street in New York City. Wow.
You say in your book that, or in fact, I heard you say it personally a few months ago in San Francisco to a group, that one of the enemies of a man of knowledge, referring to the Castaneda works, had gotten to you. I think you said it was the third enemy of the man of knowledge. What were you saying there about your own life at this point?
Well, age, the last enemy of the man of knowledge, when the body begins to deteriorate. There's nothing much you can do about that. The body is programmed and will last for a certain period of time, about 100 years at best. And it deteriorates. You no longer have as much energy as you had. Can't be helped.
How do you feel confronting the prospect of your own death at this point now? What is your...
Doesn't bother me in the least. Why should it? The thing is programmed, and at a certain point it's going to fall apart for one reason or another.
You're a biochemist, and I've heard others play with the idea of cloning, called where the cells are regenerated, that if in fact we'd reached a higher stage of perhaps the fourth or fifth level, we wouldn't need to die physically, and that we could regenerate the cells that die.
No, there's nothing in that. Old cells don't regenerate. A good deal of nonsense has been talked about cloning because people extrapolate from rather lowly organisms like newts and frogs up to human beings, but you can't do that. Like a lizard can regenerate its tail, but you can't regenerate your arm if it's chopped off. We don't have the power to regenerate our cells from one of our cells. There's only one cell, and that is the fertilized egg, which can regenerate an entire human being, and that human being is always different from the parents.
There's not a code in the DNA that could be reversed regarding death, that if we got into that kind of control over our bodies, we could do that.
I don't think anybody would bother who had that level of control. They say, what does it matter? They're probably only too thankful to shed the thing. By that time it's pretty old and infirm, and they just drop it. Like an old coat, you don't go on wearing it when it's falling apart. You just shed it. Get a new one.
Have you reached that point now? Do you feel that there's no further that you can proceed? Where are you on the path?
Oh, if I told you where I was, you wouldn't know whether I was lying or speaking the truth. I can't tell you. Transform himself. But he doesn't do that very often.
This was one of the problems with the Church of the Earth, that people got waylaid on the misuse or non-use of their sexual energy.
No, it was much more complicated than that. I was playing a game with another man who was very much older in the work than I was, and he made certain fundamental mistakes. and his mistakes actually put me in a position like checkmate. I wasn't a good enough player to be able to take into account the fact that he had made those mistakes. Yes, all right, so I have to play it differently. See, it's like a very, very difficult game of chess played in 4 dimensions. And I wasn't playing it on my own, you see. And his mistakes really got me off balance.
You said that one of the things that's a problem in developing a community is the intellectual type just can't seem to. That's one of the great pitfalls. You said that in Master Game. Is that, do you see as being where you in some?
Well, yes, the intellectuals want to sit around and talk all night. I had a whole bunch of them right in the very beginning at Berkeley when I was starting this work, but they're no use to anybody. They have to get out of that talk trip and get down to practicalities. But it's unquestionably mainly a problem of neutralizing the negative emotions which develop among people in a group, neutralizing them in some way or other. And this calls for a teacher of enormous objectivity. He has to be really, really objective with people. He mustn't indulge in his personal likes and dislikes, his preferences and so forth. Evidently, Steve Gaskin has this power.
Gaskin has definitely limited the kind of sexual activity that he finds will work to a monogamous situation. Do you?
Yes, he's gone back to the good old-fashioned monogamy because it's the only stable sexual relationship which seems to work. I know with the group with me all tried experimenting around in group marriages and so forth, but it always had disastrous results. He just gets them together and says, listen, it's till death you do part, and you better make it that way.
Ram Dass is another one who's saying now that the sexual urge, the sexual path, in no way can it be used to reach God. That seems in contradiction, both of these, in some way, to your openness about, especially regarding the cerebrotonic type. You say really should just have sex as much and as often as he needs to. How does that correlate? Do you agree with Ram Dass when he says sex can't be engaged in as a method, or even that it's really a block and a barrier to the awakening?
Oh, that's not true. That's a bunch of... No, I can't agree with that. The sexual force can be used, and it's been known in tantric circles for centuries that it can be used. But how to use it is another matter altogether.
Do you think that a lot of people in this culture particularly are not in touch with their sexual selves at all? As Wilhelm Reich suggested, that very few people are really capable of having a complete orgasm, for example.
Yes, because sex is in essence. The sex center works with essence forces, and those are very powerful forces and very ancient. But in our culture, the persona keeps poking its nose in and trying to get involved in the act, and spoils everything. So a lot of these sexual misfits and misadventures are due to people who like each other in persona and aren't really suitable for each other at all in essence. And they get together and maybe even get married and have a kid or two. And then, of course, the persona trip ceases to be interesting, and they find out that they're not suited, and so they get divorced. It's a pathetic state of affairs.
Can you describe how you harness the sexual thing for yourself and how you've used it? Do you feel that you've gotten a hold of that whole thing?
Oh, it's a very complicated trip. You have to understand that the body is not... the body as we know it is not the whole being. There's an aura which surrounds the body, and in the case of people who are actually developing, that aura can be very strong, very powerful. And the aura of the male and the aura of the female, if they're right for each other, can blend in a certain way, and the result is a certain interchange of energies. He gets from her and she gets from him, and they both enrich one another. So it's a source of very, very high energies, actually. But this only happens if they're developing in the right way, if their auras are right. There definitely is such a thing as sexual yoga, but it's very difficult because we've been so wrongly conditioned about sex. We can't treat it just like any other function. For instance, the Devadasi in the temples of India, the old temples, used sex quite definitely. They were trained to use sex. But they've all been banished from modern India. I don't think you'll find any Devadasis left.
Are you writing any more fiction?
No, I wouldn't think of it. I only ever wrote one book that got published, one fiction book.
It was your first book?
Yeah, it's a pretty bad book too.
Oh, I haven't been able to find it except on your bookshelf.
No, it didn't get anywhere.
And yet that's such a, to me, a great way to develop and grow. Do you see any, that is a path, writing literature, writing fiction, writing stories about unfoldment?
No, it's a very good way to get on the wrong track.
How so?
Because you get involved in an imaginary world and you aren't here now. You get lost in a dream world. Occasionally, very occasionally, somebody like Hermann Hesse, who had very deep insights, can put the thing across in fiction, as in The Bead Game or as in The Journey to the East. But that's rare. That's pretty rare. Well, I hope you guys will let me know when all this is going to come across on the air, and we'll tune in our little radios and see what it sounds like.
We will definitely let you know that.
I don't think I've said anything I shouldn't have said.